with the instructions so you can start using the different channels to listen to the simultaneous interpretation.
How does it work? And
yep. So hi everyone. This meeting will be in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. In order to access the simultaneous interpretation, if you're using a computer, please click on the globe at the bottom right of your screen where it says interpretation. Then select the language of your choice, and you have the option of silencing the original audio so you can hear the interpretation more clearly. When you do take the floor, make sure that you are in a silent space and that your notifications are turned off. And when you do not take the floor, please turn off your microphones, otherwise one of us will kindly do it for you. Bonjour. If you're using a cell phone or a tablet, then you need to look for the 3 dots somewhere on your screen. Click on the 3 dots, click on more, click on languages, select the language of your choice, and then confirm by pressing done. If you have any difficulty with interpretation, please write a note in the chat and we'll do our best to assist you. Bonjour, cette réunion sera en français, anglais, portugais et espagnol afin d'accéder à l'interprétation. Si vous utilisez un ordinateur, merci d'aller en bas à droite de votre écran, de cliquer sur le globe où il est écrit interprétation, de choisir la langue de votre choix et vous avez l'option de couper la langue originale afin de mieux entendre l'interprétation. Si vous utilisez un téléphone, vous cherchez ou une tablette, cherchez les 3 points sur votre appareil et vous pourrez ensuite choisir la langue de votre choix et la confirmer en appuyant sur fait. Si vous prenez la parole, essayez d'être dans un endroit silencieux et si vous ne prenez pas la parole, merci de couper votre micro, sinon nous le ferons pour vous. Ces explications vont maintenant être données en espagnol et en portugais. Go ahead, Miriam, for Spanish.
Damas y caballeros, buenas tardes, buenos días. Para utilizar la función de interpretación simultánea, esta reunión se va a celebrar en inglés, francés, portugués y español. Por favor, utilicen en la barra de herramientas a mano inferior de la pantalla del dispositivo que estén utilizando, verán un mapa mundi. Si están utilizando una computadora, a través de ese icono del mapa mundi podrán seleccionar el idioma en el que prefieran escuchar. Si están utilizando ustedes un celular o una tableta u otro tipo de dispositivo, verán los 3 puntitos en el menú correspondiente que les llevarán también a los idiomas correspondientes para poder escuchar. Cuando no estén interviniendo, por favor, les rogamos que tengan los micrófonos apagados y cuando vayan a intervenir, abran micrófono, les rogamos que se sitúen en un sitio tranquilo y sin sonido de fondo para no dificultar la reunión ni que haya interrupciones para las intérpretes. Les agradecemos su colaboración, que tengan una jornada muy fructífera.
Daniela, em português.
Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria, em primeiro lugar, de falar as instruções para saberem vocês como utilizar a linguagem, a função de tradução simultânea. Então, essa reunião, esse webinário vai ser feito em inglês, francês, português e espanhol. Para ter acesso à função de tradução simultânea, por favor, se estiver em um computador, vai ter que fazer clique no globo, no ícone do globo e apertar a função de tradução simultânea. Aí vai ter o canal de português. Por favor, escolham o canal de português para acompanhar a reunião em português. E também, se estiver conectando de um celular, uma tablete, ou um outro dispositivo, vão ter 3 pontinhos, mesma coisa, fazem clique, por favor, no 3 pontinhos e escolhem o canal de português. E também importante, quando forem participar, desligar o microfone, quando não estiverem participando, aliás, quando forem participar, ligar, e quando não forem participar, desligar o microfone, e também pedimos a gentileza de estarem se conectando de um lugar tranquilo, sem barulho. Muito obrigado e bom evento para todos.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Many thanks. I think that all the notifications have been given, and thank you to the interpreters for the participation. Otherwise, this meeting will be a little bit more convoluted. Welcome, all of you. I am Isabel Alvarez. I am part of the Urgenci network, and we are supported by the different community, and we're part of the Watch editorial board. I'm very happy to be here with you. My role today is to be the moderator, the chair. I can't see too many faces right now, but I am sure that some people will be joining who I know, and some new faces. So you are all welcome. I think this format is, well, something that we're used to, and I think that these instructions that we've heard in different languages is like the different notices that you get when you jump on a plane. Quite interesting. Well, we're gonna share this time together, and I think we're going to share a new edition of a watch session. I know we have different speakers who are going to be talking to us, and before introducing them, I want to start with acknowledgements. I know that sometimes we leave this to the end, but we don't remember everyone. So thank you to the interpreters, of course, and thank you to all of you participating, but mainly the editorial board, people who have translated documents, who have edited documents, who have reviewed documents, who have participated in the preparation of this watch. And this wouldn't be possible without your help and your work. And thank you to the funding entities, and who are Pan para el Mundo from Germany, GZZ, and the Swiss Agency for Cooperation and Development. And also thank you, Yifang, who is our eternal coordinator and ubiquitous coordinator. And thank you for all your hard work, and to FIAN, and who are always there. Well, let's continue. And again, thank you. I'm rather excited to be here. So at the end of the day, the watch, I think, is an excuse just to have a meeting and to continue through a dialogue and to be together, hand in hand. So we have several speakers, as I mentioned earlier, and they participate in our watch, and they're going to talk to us about their visions. I'm going to introduce them. I hope I can pronounce everyone's name properly. So we have Ana María Suárez-Franco, who is the permanent representative in Geneva for FIAN International. We also have Philip McMichael from Cornell University, and we have, let me see, Jones Spartegus from the National Fishworkers Forum in India. We have Jade Guthrie, apologies if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, who is from Toronto. And also we have Lucineia Freitas, who is from MST Brazil. So we have a whole host of wonderful people, and I think it's going to be really interesting. You know that the watch for this year is saying no to absolution. We have been, I think, run over. We say no to false solutions. We say no to fallacies, to these events who are, I think, the summits that actually are excuse for replacing other forums which are more necessary. Well, let's talk about these false solutions, and let's talk about the true solutions indeed. And this is what the watch is telling us. It's telling us through all the documents, through all the articles published. We see that we need to take into account these narrative, these discourses that are, well, misleading. We talk about fisheries. We talk about the alleged help to food systems, which are not such a help. And we also have an article dedicated to showing what it really is being done that is useful. So we need to highlight the positive as well, and we need to debate everything. So I'm going to leave it here, and I think I'm going to yield the floor. So I give the floor to Ana María right now, and also to Philip as well. But particularly Ana María is going to be the first to speak, so we can have an overall vision of these false solutions. so to speak. And I think that Ana Maria, together with Philip, are going to try and explain what has happened, so that we've seen that big corporations have gained more power and more control over food systems. What was the state doing in general? Why is there a vacuum there? So Ana Maria, please go ahead, and then I think Philip will intervene. You have 10 minutes each. So I'm gonna give you a wave. I'm gonna let you know when there's 1 minute left for each one of you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Isa, and thank you to all panelists and participants. I'm going to just give you an introduction as to what we think is a frame article for the watch, which is how these discourses come about. Where do they emerge from? This is an article together with Elizabeth Regine from Brazil and Tony Los Alpes in India. And we want to analyze how this emergence of the narrative within the food systems that in appearance is general, how is it a change of paradigm? Because for me, it doesn't bring any solutions. It is an empty vessel that doesn't table any specific solutions. But because it's empty, then perhaps it's been filled in with corporate solutions, which are the false solutions, or then with solutions that are actually people and nature-centric. The article also tells us why the definition of food systems based on an agro-industrial food system is actually problematic. And the article explains what the solutions and the strategies are from the corporate world, which ones are those corporate solutions that actually simply serve to perpetuate a system that doesn't work, and it doesn't actually offer real solutions, and it actually favors a context of multiple stakeholders, but that actually always given a role in companies within the governance of food systems, which is something that we didn't see before. And this increases the problem with the balance of power. And so here we have a tug of war, if you will. We're fighting to see how we fill in those empty vessels, if you will. And at the end of the article, we make a few proposals. We show some pillars which are key, which to our view are what we should be defending from the community base, from the organizational base point of view, so that we can have real solutions. And those real solutions mean that we have to be nature and people-centric. Let me tell you a little bit about these different pillars. First of all, when we talk about how that food system is born, we actually say how, despite the fact that the system has to be comprehensive and show all the different convoluted relationships concerning food systems, what we have seen throughout, for example, the CFS discussions and the Food Summit discussions is a reductionist view, is a simplistic view, which actually ignores the real problems of financing, patriarchy, colonialism, and it doesn't actually give us a guideline. It doesn't allow us to have a bearing for a more just society, for a healthier society, or a more sustainable society. So the proposal needs to be something that moves away from the current definition of food systems, because that is wrong. And we need to think about farmer systems and indigenous people systems. And we have to see how we can engage supply chains that are not corporate global supply chains, if you will. And we need to start not favoring the enrichment of the big corporation in detriment of everyone else. And here we need to talk about the finance sector and the digital world as well. So the article gives you a list of issues that are within that dominant or prevailing food system definition. And we see human rights being used as a banded concept, and it's a very superficial concept being used. And food systems are analyzed through a market perspective, really, and that's wrong. Food systems are seen as a commodity and not as something for all. So this is not sustainable. This is, as I said, a reductionist view, because at the end of the day, we have the problem of forest destruction, greenhouse gases problems. So we need really a comprehensive vision, seeing the complexity of the matter. And also, we need to pay attention to the power relationships to see how corporations are violating human rights or contribute to the violation of human rights, and how the whole corporate system is trying to justify decisions through scientific neutrality, and that's not valid, because we know that many scientists representatives of conflicts of interest themselves. And we need to think about what is the viewpoint. This is coming from the global north, ignoring the global south, if you will. And thinking about this prevailing system concept, we have seen strategies, for example, the civil society mechanism, the SCM. This will allow us to fill with content that's empty vessel, and will allow us for a different interpretation. And it's something that we're going to be dealing with when we talk about food systems. There are also people who are skeptical. We did some interviews to draft the article, and FIAN Colombia, for example, or the author from India would say, some terms come from the global north elites, and we're not going to be able to fill in that empty vessel. So we would prefer different concepts, the food processes, for example, and to perhaps base ourselves more clearly on the right to food and nutrition. The second half of the article mentions business solutions who are based on a globalized world, a globalized model that in turn increases the gap in inequalities. As I say, some of these solutions would appear, in fact, that they are sufficient, but they're not. They're simply selling the same old thing to us. More concentration of power and wealth in the same hands. And also it makes our reality a bit more fragmented, because it's a very single, they're one-track mind, if you will. We're not thinking about the small-scale producers. The small-scale producers are actually feeding 70% of the population, or more than 70% of the population. And they set the rules of the game, a game that hasn't worked, or rules that don't work for us. So we have the argument of the fortified foods, which are presented to us as this is a solution for malnutrition, but they're also an opportunity for business for the corporate world. And it actually is a disconnect. It doesn't 2 minutes, you have 2 minutes, and it doesn't really link communities to the spiritual side of, or to the natural side of feeding. We've also talked about the weakening of institutions, and we need to strengthen, and we need to stop, I beg your pardon, we need to stop the strengthening of these power of these corporate sectors. And also we have started seeing the use of agroecology, which also at the same time affects these power relationships. And is also focusing on data and science, but is ignoring the knowledge and the wisdom of indigenous communities. And at the end of the day, we talk about the key things that we should be defending, and I'm going to mention some, which is the importance of recovering and defending the role of the public institutions, which have actually moved away, and they have given way to the corporate world. So they have a legal responsibility. And also we need to think about different solutions, so differentiation of solutions, the importance of not simply thinking about standard solutions. We need to recognize that we need a diversity of solution will depend on the context, and also we really need to include farmers and indigenous populations, fishermen, shepherds, and also we make a final reflection about human rights from the viewpoint of food sovereignty, and also we link this to environmental principles, which to us are the solution that will make things nature and people centric and will actually make our governments accountable, and that would mean that we need new tools which let us remember to the different declarations. Thank you, Isa. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, no, muy bien. Bueno, pues doy la palabra a
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to Philippe so that he can add on to what we've said and maybe talk a little bit about what has happened for us to find ourselves in this situation. Philippe, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Isa. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. And I'd like to thank Yifang for inviting me and instructing me what I should be talking about, which is precisely what Isa just said. So how have corporations gained such food power, and what's been the role of states? And in order to do this, I think we need to go back to the origins of the US empire after World War II, because it's a way to trace the way in which over the last 75 years, corporations have in fact come to occupy a global food system. I always like to point out that there's only one global food system, but there are many other food systems and food cultures, which Ana Maria has just talked about. So just with a brief overview, and I'm going to run through the decades pretty quickly up to the present day, from the origins of the US empire to the United Nations Food System Summit that just took place, which was a scandal. So after World War II, it's really important to see that geopolitics begin to organize the way in which food provisioning on a world scale operates. And this, in the long run, is at the expense of stable territorial-based food systems, such as they were. And one has to keep in mind that some of the post-colonial states had already had some of the parts of their agricultures reorganized to supply Europe in particular. So in the 1940s, of course, the United Nations articulated the ideal of the right to food, and food security is a human right. And that is still a principle, but it's been eroded very significantly in the last few years, as we know. So the first false solution, picking up on what Ana Maria was talking about, was the US food aid program after World War II, by which very quickly the US was disposing of food surpluses as aid to strategic third world states on the perimeter of the Cold War in order to help them industrialize with cheap food. The long-term plan was to move from aid to commercial imports to those countries from the United States and Europe as the bread baskets. In Korea, for example, the US introduced bread. Now Koreans know that, we all know that Koreans just love rice, but in fact, the US was providing money to enable Korean housewives to learn to make bread and feed bread to their families. So that's the first part of the story. The second part is in the 60s and 70s, we saw green revolution technologies being introduced with public subsidy. So states are very much involved in this whole process. And here agro-technologies were replacing local farming systems. In the next decade, in the 1980s, there was a debt crisis, and the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, compelled third world states to undergo structural adjustment, and in particular, to encourage food exports to defray debt. So once again, corporations are getting in on the act via the public institutions and the states. In the 1990s, we saw NAFTA and the World Trade Organization liberalization versus national farm protection. So the whole idea was opening up the food trade and foreign investment in agro-exporting. The Director General of the WTO said, we're writing the constitution of a global economy. So states were now to serve markets, and comparative advantage was the new theme, if you like. And so agro-exporting became the sort of major way in which the food system was being restructured. Transnational corporations claimed that they could feed the world. And in the 1996 Food Summit in Rome, the food sovereignty movement emerged, contesting that claim, arguing that states were complicit in this process and needed to recognize their own sovereignty, and in turn to establish and promote food sovereignty on a democratic basis within society, so that territorial farm systems could be rebuilt. At the same time, some less developed countries were allowed some protections, but of course that's eroded over the last couple of decades. Initially, India was very defiant to protect its own domestic food stocks, but now we're seeing India opening up to corporate retailers like Walmart to come in and take over versus street markets and local groceries, and millions of people who depend on wet markets, etc., across India. And secondly, we've seen Prime Minister Modi recently attempting to legislate corporate access to land and food for export, and of course precipitating an incredible farmers' rebellion that I think is very instructive for us all, because it's not just farmers who are rebelling, it's lawyers and chefs and social workers and doctors and truckers and other workers who are building this incredible alliance to support the farmers. And I think that we'll see more of this in the future. The 21st century was the financialization era. And this is when land becomes a financial asset. So not just corporations, but also equity companies, pension companies are investing in land that they have no business investing in. They know nothing about farming. And this is happening on a world scale. The Brazilians know this very well. And at the same time, we're seeing the reduction of food to fungible commodities. So the substitution of vegetable oils for butter as an industrial process allows corporates and financiers to get involved in reorganizing the food system. Ana Maria mentioned this also. So we now see sugars, oils, grains as inputs for durable foods, not as foods in and of themselves. And this, of course, promotes endless processing of foodstuffs via a financial logic. The next part of the 21st century is the public-private partnership idea, which the UN promoted in the year 2000 with the UN Social Compact, when the UN was attempting to encourage corporations to adopt social responsibilities. Of course, that hasn't happened, but anyway, AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which was funded by the Gates Foundation in 2006, was the exemplar of this public-private partnership, whereby states would provide credit to enable philanthropy and private capital to come in and establish agro-input systems to encourage farmers to purchase commercial seeds and inputs that they would need, such as chemicals, fertilizers, etc., to grow their food. Two other examples of the public-private partnership were the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa, where the G7 encouraged private corporations to come into about 10 African countries and establish corridors of industrial food for export. So that was another example. And that public-private partnership has moved all the way up to the present day, with people arguing that the United Nations has now become a public-private partnership. In 2008, after the food crisis in 2008, there was a food summit in Rome where value chain agriculture was encouraged, again, encouraging corporations and financiers to invest in industrial agriculture at the level of small farming systems. And of course, what happens there is that insofar as those farmers are surrendering their own knowledge of landscapes to industrial inputs, they're becoming simply laborers on their own land, producing food not for their neighbors and citizens, but for foreign consumers. Right up to the present day, we have the 2020 World Economic Forum establishing this devil's bargain with the United Nations, which was an incredible thing that happened. And of course, Klaus Schwab, who was the original founding chair of the World Economic Forum, which represents the 1,000 largest multinationals in the world, arguing that multilateralism was dead. And the reason why he's arguing that was because of the austerity protests and food riots that were cascading across the world from the 2008 food crisis through the financial crisis in around the same time. And you know, we saw the Arab Spring and various other incredible protests that were going on. And what Klaus Schwab was doing was recognizing that these protests were contesting or threatening the legitimacy of the large agribusiness corporations and financiers. And this is very much part of the idea of the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein coined, the idea that when things get pretty bad, the possibility for some organic progressive policy is right there. And so corporations step in and attempt to stem the tide by pushing governments to take countermeasures. And what I'm getting at here is that the World Economic Forum successfully managed to get the whole... Okay, thank you. The World Economic Forum managed to get the United Nations, which represents all of the states, not just one state. So this is the culmination of the shock doctrine on a global scale, to attempt to blunt the the protests, the food sovereignty movements, all of the rebellions that we've been talking about, and the counter movements that are still building across the world, and in fact showed their power, I think, over the last year with their resistance to the Food Systems Summit. But what's really interesting is about that summit, and Ana Maria mentioned this too, that Farmer Voice and the CFS were marginalized initially. They weren't taken seriously at all until widespread protests. Even so, I think that the Food Systems Summit really is a smokescreen for what's going on behind the scenes, and that is attempting to build the legitimacy and capacity for the corporate sector to become the governors of the global food system. And just on that point, I'd argue that I'd point out that food corporations actually now command billions more in infrastructure across the world beyond the multi-billion-dollar markets for their goods, including $540 billion annually in global subsidies from governments and international financial institutions that are on track to soar to $1.8 trillion, 1.3 trillion pounds a year by 2030. So ultimately, this kind of infrastructure has the capacity to lock in these governing structures. And so we have a big task ahead of us. Nevertheless, I think the legitimacy of corporate industrial agriculture, now bio-digital agriculture, where Google and various other digital companies are now beginning to take agriculture over. These are going to be issues that we're going to be fighting for some time. La Via Campesina talked about industrial agriculture as agriculture without farmers. And what I'm suggesting with the bio-digital takeover is we're going to see agriculture without humans, where decisions are made from the safety and comfort of urban offices, far away from the fields where crops are being grown. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Isa.
Muchísimas gracias.
A million thanks. I had to limit the time because we all have many interesting things to say, and we would just go on and on because it's so fascinating. And before giving the floor to Jones, Lucineia, and Jade for other topics, there was a question in the chat, wasn't there? Because maybe we're taking for granted that everybody knows what we're talking about when we're talking about the summit. And there was one person asking about the summit when Ana María was taking the floor. I don't know whether Ana María or Philip, in 2 minutes, is able to explain to somebody what this summit was all about. Just to clarify it, because it can happen that not everybody knows about the summit. Ana María, would you like to say something?
I will try to summarize. Okay, maybe I will do. So, perdón, en español.
Please excuse me, I'd like to speak Spanish. The summits among states on food and agriculture topics have been held since 1943. There have been already quite a few. And the one that took place this year in September has been criticized quite a bit because the United Nations usually holds them so that nations can talk about global governance and the future of food, nutrition, and agriculture as proposed by the states. But in this case, the summit was not an initiative of the states, but instead, and from what we've heard, it was held because the World Economic Forum and the General Secretary of the United Nations decided that it should be organized, including, the nation states afterwards, and they proposed it to take place in September. During the meeting, different topics were covered, and so-called solutions to fight against malnutrition and hunger in accordance with the SDGs. And I want you to understand why we're actually criticizing this. We weren't aware from within the civil society about this summit. And we didn't support it because we believe that it skipped all the regular channels that are necessary to take to organizing a meeting like this. And it was more or less, like a meeting between the agri-food industry and the states, or those who support the agri-food industry and the states. And they did not include people who feed practically 70 to 80% of our planet. That's why quite a few movements from civil society organizations didn't participate at the meeting. And there was a pre-summit, and we did a counter pre-summit and then a summit in September. And now what we've actually done is establish a follow-up mechanism that we don't acknowledge as valid. And as Isabel has said, it might seem to create parallel levels to the ones that had already been established in the past in rural movements and who had a very broad decision-making capacity. I don't know whether anybody else would like to say something about this. There's some people who are more active in these matters in Rome, but nevertheless, throughout the meeting, if any questions arise, we'll be able to clarify them. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the explanation. I think that we sometimes take for granted that everybody understands what we're talking about, but it's really good to clarify matters. And now, with no further ado, we're going to give the floor to Jones, Lucineia, and Jade. And we want them to tell us about what they think about this from their countries, what they think about full solutions, and what their movements think, what the countries think, and what have nations actually done for these full solutions to arise, and which are the actual solutions that should be implemented. And like Philip had said at the beginning, We are right now celebrating the 25th anniversary of food sovereignty. And when you review the situation, it seems more important than ever to speak out clearly about these topics. I'm going to give the floor to Jones, and then to Lucineia, and then Jade, more or less because of a language issue, so that we can mix the language. So you have the floor.
Hello. Am I audible to everyone? So, first of all, I thank for this wonderful summit. Wonderful summit about the wonderful summit of talking about the right to food with regard to the false solutions that the state has been falsely propagating to the since decades and also through the centuries of colonial history. So here I want to share about I will try to because the topic is about demand for food and nutrition. We should understand demand and food and nutrition from India, a developing country perspective, because we are the largest population, where there will be more demand for food and where there will be more demand for nutrition. So from that perspective, and also I will talk from the perspective of marine fishes, how the how marine fishes has been trapped under this demand for food and nutrition, and how their way of life has been what transformations has been happened and how they have been marginalized. So starting from, I will also, as the previous speakers noted about the prehistories, noted about the histories of noted about the histories, how the transformation happened. Let me also touch little histories, and then come little bit as a then highlight the today's context of the United Nations Food Summit. So starting from the post-independence in 1950s, India got independence in 1950 as a developing country, and since 1950 we started our 5-year plan, 5-year development, nation's development plan. There was the word called demand of food and nutrition when it comes to the sector of fisheries. However, fisheries was a subsector or a subsection of a larger agriculture. For the larger agriculture, fish and livestock is a subsection of the agriculture sector. So this is how.
Apologies, this is one of the interpreters.
Yeah,
you need to use the mic, and can you please not move around so much, because there's a lot of interference with your line.
Okay. Am I? So this starting from 1950, the Food and Agriculture Organization of UN has recommended India with a large recommended India for the development of fisheries. They recommended large boats to yield more and more fishes. That is that they drafted a production. They converted the fishing sector, the hunting sector, to a larger production industry. So they said that their recommendations are very clear in the post-colonial developments, post-independence development of India. Clearly, from the technical cooperation of World Food and Agriculture Organization, it recommended India to adopt large vessels, large active gears, and also large mechanized goods with all advanced technologies. They transformed the traditional boats, and they said the word very clearly that indigenous traditional fishing crafts and gears are not suitable for production or are not suitable for developing the fisheries sector. With this connotation and with these recommendations, India invested in India with the financial support of the international finance institutions like IMF and World Bank. They have brought many trawlers in. They have introduced trawlers. They have introduced mechanized vessels, alternative to the traditional fishing crafts. But what happened? These trawlers, or whether it is a trawler or the mechanized trawlers, are sufficient for a resource hunt, that is the shrimp or the prawns, which has the value in those days. It is called pink revolution in those days. So what happened, still 1960s in India, shrimp or the prawns were being used as manure for coconut trees. But when this when the trawlers came into the sea, and when prawns had a international or a export market and export production link, immediately what happened is that manure becomes a food for the entire globe. Indian manure has become a food for the entire globe. And what happened is that the farm-based landlords or the farm-based community, farm-based landlords invested in the fishing sector. Say example, before shrimp has been used as a manure for coconut trees. Coconut coirs had export value. Then when the trawlers came, and then there was a market for this shrimp food, immediately what happened is that the coconut farmers invested in the invested in trawlers and mechanized boats. That's what the transformation happened. But this food transformation and this export oriented production policies had a great impact on the identity of the capture fisheries, because the non-fisher is now getting venture into the fishing. So obviously the indigenous or the traditional marine fishing communities are totally excluded by this global production oriented policy, which has been pushed by the transnational corporations as well as financed by IMF and others into a developing nations. So you can also imagine that if you see the mechanized boats are called mechanized boats. If you see the nets are nylon nets, and they are from the other developed countries. They are sponsored by other development countries. Machines, engines, Korean engines, Japanese engines. So it is like that. Still 1950s to 1990s, before the neoliberal, it is like the active gears for more and more production, and the entire transformation of a subsistence fishing from a traditional community. Now it has been transformed to a fishing production oriented export industry. So seafood, with the core of the seafood values. So what happened is that we can easily understand that the demand of nutrition is not for India, but the demand and the demand of food and nutrition is for the entire globe. Rather, the clear-cut impact is that it destroyed the local and feeded the global. Developing countries' resources has been destroyed, and it feeded the entire developed countries. For a developed country, Western European nations to eat prawns, we have destroyed the entire seabed and the trawling industry has established. Then what happened in 1960s, a neoliberal kid came into the scene of coastal fishery sector. That is the aquaculture, the neoliberal kid. This neoliberal kid, what it did is that it occupied the entire coastal regions. There was traditionally, cultured shrimp culture is part of the peasant's life. But what happened in 1992 when India adopted neoliberal policies, they gave an alternative, and they said that the entire fishing resources has been overexploited, which has been gifted by them through their mechanized trawlers. But the ultimate blame came to the fishers, and they shifted to culture fisheries. So culture fisheries, when it has been boosted to the fishers, all the coastal lands has been occupied, has been leased out. It is totally leased out for tenures to the landlords to do fish, to cultivate fish farm, to cultivate shrimp farms, and also crab farming, fish farming. So what happened is that we can understand from 1990s that the shrimp farms are started in the riverbeds. The entire riverbeds has been occupied. All the ecological sensitive areas or the riverbeds has been totally occupied with these farms. And now the farms are not a traditional farms. These farms has been converted to a industry. From feed to harvest, it is totally networked or interlinked with the company or a corporate who is supplying the entire thing. Supply like a seed goes seed, feed, medicine, everything. So for a food eater, for a shrimp eater, when the shrimp comes to the plate, he can't understand whether it is a wild shrimp or whether it is a farmed shrimp. For him, the food should be there. But the difference between the wild and the wild shrimp and the farmed shrimp is that the nutrient value. So obviously the demand of nutrition or malnutrition, the false solution, it is very clear that this will not be achieved. It cannot be, because a farmed shrimp cannot antibiotic or a genetically modified shrimp cannot withstand cannot give the same nutrition of a wild shrimp. So this is the clear-cut example of a false solution that has been pushed by the state. Rather, through this transformation of fisheries, the entire shrimp culture, entire marine capture fishers, who are the traditional fishers, life has been marginalized. Their land has been occupied by culture fisheries, and their entire resources has also been exploited by the deep sea trawlers, shrimp trawlers, and as well as the mechanized offshore trawlers. So it was still 90s and the 90s to 2000. Post tsunami, or now the decade is for the culture fisheries. Now the entire statistics of the world culture, the world aquaculture report, we can easily understand. It is a thin line stating that all the oceans, whether it is a Pacific Ocean or it is all the oceans, they are saying that there is no fish in the fishes.
Jones, te quedan 2 minutos y también, por favor,
so now
you have 2 minutes, and please can you use the microphone, because the interpreter cannot hear you. Thank you.
So now coming to the, I will complete in 2 minutes. Yeah, thank you so much. So now coming to the arena is that today's arena of culture fisheries. Culture fisheries is totally dominate. Culture fisheries dominate the fisheries sector. If you see the world reports like World Aquaculture and Fisheries Report, the dominance of the rapid growth of culture fisheries has been dominating the entire fisheries sector. Now the entire shift happened from culture fisheries to capture to culture. Take example, in 1950, the percentage of capture fisheries contributing to the global national GDP of India, it is 78%, and culture fisheries is just 20%. Now it is totally reverse. Now culture fisheries is contributing more than 79%, and capture fisheries contribution is 21%. This is not because of the transfer of the this. Rather, one side it is creating a conflict between a non-fisher and a fisher, a peasant, a farmer and a fisher. The changing food policies, which has been boosted by the corporations. Food, exactly, food is a commodity. This commodity seafood industry has been marginalizing the capture fisheries, traditional capture fisheries, to the core. Now the false solution was mariculture activities in the marine spaces. The entire marine spaces, exclusive economic zones, and also the territorial waters of the seaward side has also been occupied by mariculture, farming in the sea. This is what the recent United Nations Food Summit is also, all the corporates are pushing for mariculture, and the entire reports, entire statistics of fisheries clearly says that there is no fish in the sea. So we can't, because it cannot be. If it is there, then it is the end of the earth, because 78% of the globe, the entire earth is occupied by seawater. So you can't say that there is no fish in the sea or it has been overexploited. Then it is a huge crisis of climate. So now this mariculture push by these corporates occupying sea space. As I said, first it occupied the boats, it transformed the boats, then it occupied the coastal lands, and now they are occupying the sea space. So this is a clear-cut marginalization and the subjugation and the dispossession of the rights of the traditional marine capture fisheries, and this is going to the extreme. This will go, and this will not, it is a false solution of, it is a clear-cut evidential false solution when you compare with the fisheries sector. So we as fishers advising the whatever as I said, people doesn't understand or the eaters cannot differentiate the food what they eat. Rather, if they cannot differentiate what fish it is or what shrimp it is, how they can understand the global corporates politics on their plate. So this is where the entire globe and the movements of the peasants and the workers movement should join together to stop this corporatization of the food systems. Thank you one and all. Thank you so much. Hello.
Thank you very much, Jones. That was a very interesting intervention. I think that Philip and Jones had spoken before this meeting, or it would have appeared that way because Philip has reviewed the historical elements of the system and Jones has spoken about all the practicalities of the fisheries. So they complement each other, I think, in both their presentations. And we have been, our feet are now firmly on the ground. We have been landed. Thank you to those interventions then. And now we're gonna talk to Lucineia. I think you're with us. And Jones has talked about false solution, but you can also talk about real solutions. So please go ahead.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this debate and to bring some information on Brazil and our current affairs, but focusing on the historic aspect of thinking about the agribusiness. And it was installed in Brazil in the 60s, 70s with the need to fight hunger and food insecurity of the population. And only from the years 2000s onwards, the state started to invest in family agriculture. And from that moment on, we witnessed food insecurity. It was a time that Brazil was able to fight hunger, combat hunger, and improved its rating in this sense. And in the last years, we've had a change, and I think this is very patent because in 2018, when the current president was elected, his first initiative was to do away with food security in Brazil. And this clearly shows how he sees this process of food security and the importance of the investment that had been done in this process to guarantee this food security and to guarantee food systems in place to take care and protect the population. The MS team has undergone conversations that hunger is a problem that has to be faced as a collective issue. It isn't a problem that is down to the state or corporations. It's a problem that is important to society as a whole. And in a collective sense, it has to be thought of in terms of social organizations, and the movements who have held this conversation are trying to make headway. So trying to combat hunger is breaking away with an economic viewpoint to produce food. So you have to think about food production as a merchandise. It's prejudicial to us in order for us to deal with combating hunger. And in this sense, we have to rethink the process tied to the Gates Revolution, because here in Brazil, one of the largest difficulties we have in terms of production for quality foodstuff, organic foodstuff, has been the advancement of agribusiness with aerial pulverization of agrotoxic fertilizers. And it makes it very difficult to produce under other techniques. So we see a need that we need a state regulation to regulate the use of these products that we don't have right now in Brazil. So the government is constantly freeing up fertilizers which are prohibited in other parts of the country, of the world, and they are able to use them here in Brazil. So the indigenous people and the smallholder farmers and the farmers are affected by this. In the past years, we've had a significant increase in food insecurity in Brazil and the number of people who suffer from hunger. And we've realized that the initiatives that were developed to face this issue was basically owed to the social movements of the farm and the city in terms of organization of families from their requirements for people in vulnerable situations, and also in producing foodstuffs from the people in the and the MST donated more than 5 tons in the last 18 months of foodstuff, and 1 million food dishes are produced in this time. So agribusiness is considered an activity which is a priority activity, and it had the largest investment and the 2 bills of law to strengthen the family agriculture in order to deal with the hunger that Brazil faces was halted by the president. So in this time, we've had more solidarity, we've had an increase in need for foodstuff, but we haven't had any initiative from the state to strengthen these initiatives that these grassroots initiatives have developed to be able to deal with hunger. And so if we think about this situation, we assess it in a way that there are 2 demands. So one is civil society and these popular social movements. They have to continue producing foodstuff and helping in institutions in solidarity, but they also have to put pressure on the state so that they can take the necessary measures, because we've been shown in other times of our history that they are effective. And so we have to think about how we can deal with this. And we have to look at Brazil as a whole. On one side, we have to strengthen production of foodstuff by taking up the reins of some existing technical assistance and credit. So this can help the production. These initiatives exist, and so what we have to do is to think about the demarcation of the indigenous people, to respect their cultural means of production, respecting the way in which they cultivate their products, and diversity in production, and also respect the environment, because the agribusiness on our native territory has reduced this different opportunity of foodstuffs, and this also affects the people in the indigenous regions. And also think about public purchasing that was carried out by the PAA, which was a project from the federal government, which worked well until 2016. And so purchases were made directly to the farmers, and a donation was made to people in vulnerable situations. So initiatives such as this strengthen the organization of production of the farmers, and at the same time, it strengthens the organization of society as a whole in providing an answer to meet its requirements. And in Brazil, we also need to go back to some initiatives to face the large organizations. So this control of monoculture on indigenous land
sobre el suelo
and
indígena y
all of
sobre
our
otros,
biomes, but namely in the Cerrado and the Amazon region, and the
en la
control of
región.
agrotoxics, which
Hemos-
is affecting the population as well. And this offers some food with very low nutritional value and also full of toxins. And we also have to think about the fact that the government has to control inflation. Inflation has increased astronomically. And so this means that people don't have purchasing power for foodstuff. And without a control of the cost of food, it's impossible to guarantee the right to food, namely for the population. And so these initiatives have to have an articulation between various social movements in the countryside and in the urban centers to put pressure on the state to create effective initiatives based on successful experiences of the past. And that's why this debate on food sovereignty and nutrition is so important, because there has been a huge increase in hunger in our country, at the same time that there's also a huge increase in exports of agribusiness to countries in Europe and the Far East and the Orient. Thank you very much for your invitation and for inviting me to this conversation today.
Muchísimas gracias a ti.
A million thanks, Lucineia. It was extremely interesting, and particularly interesting to see what can be done even when we don't have any state support. So now let's go and have a look and see what are things like in Toronto. You have the floor.
Thanks so much, and thank you for inviting me to be here. This is one of the most exciting panels I've got to be a part of, so I really appreciate the invitation. So yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about Toronto and more broadly, just from, you know, like the so-called global North perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada and the US and UK. And I think it's really important to, you know, recognize when we're talking about these countries and from this perspective that, you know, to recognize that these countries' economic and social structures are colonial, low road capitalist ones. So that means that they began on the backs of enslaved people and indigenous communities. And today they continue to disproportionately impact BIPOC communities very violently. You know, I think it's also really important to highlight that within these kind of like low road capitalist conditions, regulations are really low, the tax structures tend to favor those with money, wealth inequality is really extreme, and this often really kind of replicates the plantation dynamics that originated with the transatlantic slave trade. So, you know, under these conditions and within this context in these countries, profit is consistently prioritized over human rights, and we see that over and over again playing out within the food system itself. So within this framework, then, you know, it's no surprise that we see these corporations with this kind of like unchecked power over shaping what our food system looks like and how it works and how it kind of plays out on the ground. And it's within this context that these false responses to food insecurity that we've been hearing about from the other panelists have kind of taken shape around the global North in response to food insecurity. So here in Canada, as well as in the UK and the US, there have been increases in the provision of charitable food, and that has very much been accompanied by growing corporate partnerships. So the answer to food insecurity and food injustice and hunger in these countries has largely been focused on this concept of food banking. And this has really created a kind of like toxic love triangle between the state and food banks and corporations. So food banking, you know, it began as a very temporary response to the issue of food insecurity and hunger. You know, here in Canada, the first food bank only opened its doors about 40 years ago in Alberta in 1981. And yet, despite only being around for a few decades now, food banking has become so deeply entrenched in our state's response to food insecurity that it feels quite difficult to even imagine a world without food banks in the global North, oftentimes. The original food banks that were kind of opened back in the 80s were established and operated by communities themselves. So they were created by trade unions and unemployed action centers, cultural groups, religious groups, and these kind of folks who were responding to a need within their own communities and kind of exercising this kind of project and mutual aid, right? But what happened very quickly was that the state co-opted these initiatives, really seeing them as this opportunity to adopt a kind of like at arm's length governance approach to the issue of food insecurity. So what began as a temporary community-driven response has now become many governments' kind of go-to solution for a problem that is clearly no longer and never was temporary, right? I think it's important to highlight that by design, charity-based responses to food insecurity, like food banking, really have foundations on that are built on volunteer labor, right? And what this does is really props up a broader failing system of state support. So food banks that depend on the labor of unpaid helpers and volunteers effectively gives the state another out, right? Another way to not pay people and not to provide decent work opportunities. And you know, these nonprofit organizations, these food banks, they receive millions and millions of dollars in funding and subsidies from the state every year. Just last year here in Canada, the Canadian government added over $100 million to the Emergency Food Security Fund, a significant portion of which went directly into the pockets of Food Banks Canada, which is kind of like our national food bank organization here in Canada. So, you know, instead of effecting meaningful policy changes that will actually ensure the right to food for folks living in Canada, our government instead has focused on kind of funneling money into these emergency food support initiatives, right? And they do this both through these kind of government granting opportunities, like I mentioned, this Emergency Food Security Fund, as well as kind of by creating and writing legislation that incentivizes corporate giving. And so that's where this kind of like love triangle is completed. I think it's really important to highlight that corporations who donate food to food banks, you know, they're like leftover rescued food, it's often termed, this idea of rescuing food. These corporations often benefit from tax credits as well as like PR boosts, public relation boosts, which has really been amped up over the course of the pandemic and has really kind of deepened this alliance between emergency food aid and corporations. What's really crucial to note is that these corporate giants along the food chain, right? So these like agribusiness corporations who are donating their rescued food, or even like grocery store chains who are donating their rescued food, these companies who are benefiting from tax credits and similar kind of funding opportunities are the same companies that consistently exploit their workers who are disproportionately BIPOC folks, while also at the same time overpaying their top executives, right? And what this does is it forces these folks who are working for these companies, these low-wage workers, to rely instead on government programs for survival, while still freeing up like this corporate cash for donations that they then receive tax breaks for. So the same corporations, the same big food corporations who they're effectively creating the conditions that breed and perpetuate poverty and food insecurity while profiting off of those same conditions. And, you know, I think it's obvious a lot of small independent food suppliers and food stores have struggled over the past year and a half with the pandemic. But business at these big corporate food chains has boomed over the past year and a half. So these same corporations that lobby against things like minimum wage increases, the same corporations that break up unions, refuse to provide paid sick days, have found a way to really kind of profit off of the global pandemic. For example, here in Canada, there's Loblaws Corporation, which is owned by the Weston family, who are often termed like the royal family of Canada. And they've posted record profits during the pandemic. And yet, you know, their workers are forced to rely on food banks because they refuse to pay anything more than a minimum wage and actively lobby against raising the minimum wage. You know, they've also done things like gotten a PR boost for providing hero pay, which was like a $2 bonus to workers who were working on the front line. And then as soon as the PR kind of went away from that, they rolled these programs back, right? They also refused to provide sick days during the pandemic to workers who were stocking the shelves at grocery stores. And yet the CEOs were receiving, you know, millions in salary over the last year and have received many tax breaks. over the course of the pandemic for donating food to food banks. I think it's really important to draw this connection between the fact that the folks who are being forced deeper into poverty and food insecurity, who have been forced further into poverty and food insecurity over the course of the pandemic, are people who predominantly work along the food chain as well here in the global north. So folks like migrant farm workers who come in through different agricultural immigration programs, meat processing warehouse workers, grocery store workers. These are, you know, who we've kind of dubbed frontline heroes. They're risking their lives to put food on the tables across the global north, and yet they're struggling to feed themselves and their own families as a result of this kind of like corporate culture of exploitation that exists along the food chain. You know, at the end of the day, this relationship between food banks and corporations and the state, what these arrangements really allow is for the government to further sidestep their responsibilities, right? Even though they've signed on to guaranteeing the right to food for citizens in Canada, using this kind of like food banking, food charity approach really allows them to step away from those responsibilities and download them onto the nonprofit sector instead. You know, when we talk about what are the true solutions to food insecurity, because obviously food banking is not one, it's really crucial that we stop focusing on these kind of like band-aid temporary charity responses and begin focusing on the structures, right, that actually drive the conditions of food insecurity, as well as kind of shifting away from the top-down responses that just further embed the social inequities that we're seeing. So like the other panelists have mentioned, we really need a diversity of responses. There's no one response that's going to fit all, right? And we need responses that are modeled based on the communities that are impacted by food insecurity, based on the communities who are growing the food and feeding people, because these are the folks who already know what a transformed food system could look like and what a just and equitable food system could look like, right? So, you know, the causes of food insecurity, they were palpable and they were felt very hard long before the pandemic. And we've seen many kind of mutual aid initiatives pop up over the course of the pandemic, and they've become a bit more, they've been brought into the light, but again, those are also not new, right? There's been grassroots initiatives and groups and communities and broader global social movements like these that have long histories of organizing and responding to food injustice in their own communities, right? So things like mutual aid, solidarity brigades, even like increased household and community food production. We've heard about some really good ones today as well. And all of these are practices that are rooted in Indigenous and Black communities, kind of like practices around community care and reciprocity, right? And I think for us in the global north, what the pandemic has really done is highlighted both the necessity and the strength of these mutual aid models of community care for communities who are most impacted by food insecurity and poverty. What it's really shown us is that these models of solidarity and reciprocity are necessary for survival, but they're also examples of what, you know, these like true solutions to ending food insecurity could look like. These are solutions that actually center people and communities rather than things like profit or wealth building. So, you know, if we're talking about what true solutions look like, I think going forward, we need to really be prioritizing this type of community leadership. You know, it's so important to note that the communities who are impacted by poverty, the communities who experience food insecurity, they already know what they want, right? They already know what they need. Our communities have already dreamt up all of the possibilities of what this new food system could look like. We're already doing this work on the ground, maybe on a smaller scale, but the solutions are there, right? The solutions exist. We know what they are. It's just a matter of supporting that community leadership, resource sharing, wealth redistribution, to be able to facilitate the work and grow it. And, you know, I think it was María who mentioned there needs to be this kind of like diversity of approaches as well, right? So we do need to be prioritizing community leadership, following their lead, but we also need to be pushing for structural changes at the state level, right? Like the state does have a responsibility here. And we need to make sure we're holding the state accountable for systemic changes to things like, how do we implement income-based approaches so people can actually have money in their pockets to buy food? How do we implement something like a guaranteed right to housing? Because we have a huge housing crisis here in Canada right now. How do we implement regulations around decent and fair wage work? These are all of the other parts of not necessarily, they're not often talked about when we talk about food insecurity or our food system, but they're very much a huge barrier to achieving food security or food justice for folks in Canada and the broader global north. So I think for me, that's what a people-centered or a true solution looks like. It's this kind of multi-layered response. And it's really important that we ensure we're kind of building a system that's truly inclusive and doesn't leave anyone behind, while also making sure that we're kind of taking care of one another in the meantime. So yeah, thanks so much for having me.
A million thanks to you too for your presentation. I would like to thank you all for speaking within the time limits. I'm really sorry I'm so strict. And we still have 5 minutes left because we have to finish at past. But I wanted to ask Anna and Philip, who were the first speakers, whether they would like to add something to what's been said. On the ground, they would have to be, very short comments, but if you would like to add something about what your colleagues have said and how this is linked to what you've said, and if that were the case, this is the time to do so. I can't see any reactions. Anna? In a couple of minutes, Isa, I would like to say something which I believe is closely linked with what Jade has said. This system, transfers responsibilities from one party to the other. So the responsibility of guaranteeing the right to food and all the connected rights is usually in the state. And what we're seeing now happening is that companies, corporations are taking over governance that should be in the hands of states. But the responsibility for malnutrition and undernourishment is in the hands of the individual, because they're telling them, you don't exercise, you don't eat well, without taking into account the structural conditions they live in. And furthermore, Jade said that part of the responsibility of abiding by the law is being given to these non-profit organizations, which obviously doing these things for charitable reasons, and you can't ask anything from them because you're not supposed to. So maybe one of the first questions that we asked ourselves is, where are our states or where were they when this happened? Philip gave us a general historical overview. And what I have analyzed with many of you is that states have been, unburdening these responsibilities and leaving them to others. And they're also saying that the people who are suffering are the guilty ones. Thank you, Anna. Philip, a couple of minutes, just in case you want to add something.
Yeah, thanks. I would just add a couple of examples of successful state interventions. And I think this is in the context of the pandemic crisis that has, I think, revealed, as we've mentioned before, this broken global food system. And I think it's also in a context where there's more interest and recognition in the possibility of public intervention. Now, I'm not trying to be giving a rosy picture because this is an uphill struggle, but nevertheless, I think we're at a moment where public intervention is going to become more and more important because of these kinds of issues, in particular, also because of environmental degradation and climate change. So just going back to the multilateral issue that I mentioned, one of the issues there that a couple of people have also talked about is that the World Economic Forum has correctly identified the flaws in multilateralism in the sense that governments have surrendered responsibility, as Jade and various other people have mentioned, to the private sector. So in a sense, it's kind of an open door for the World Economic Forum to come in and say, well, we have the corporate infrastructure, we can take care of the world food systems. This is I think the key issue that we're going to have to fight against. Now, one thing that I've been arguing for years is that we really need a much better form of communication of success stories, and two success stories I can think of one was President Lula in Brazil's Freedom from Hunger or Zero Hunger campaign, where the MST was encouraged to produce staple foods, which the government then purchased from the MST farms and passed on to the Brazilian poor. And that I think was a very simple but very effective program where the government actually took responsibility for food security, etc. And the second example is the zero budget natural farming that is expanding, incredibly in southern India, where local states are actually supporting this movement of agroecological farming. It's been inspired by and led by the KRRS, which is a La Via Campesina chapter in southern India. So it seems to me that one task that we should really get involved in on a long-term basis is to begin to document very clearly that there are all these possibilities and initiatives out there that can be copied and networked across the world. So that's my last contribution. Thank you very much, Isa.
Muchísimas gracias. Genial, además, terminar.
A million thanks. It's wonderful, to conclude with some good examples and leave with a view of the future. In fact, you were talking about India and somebody was asking in the chat what was happening in southern India. But I'm sorry, due to the fact that we have the interpreters, I cannot go on for very much longer.
Publicación que estamos presentando.
The article that we are submitting to you actually delves into many of these topics, and I think we have seen many key elements cropping up in our conversation. I've been noting down key elements throughout all the interventions, and Jones was talking about the how traditional fisheries were being dismantled because it wasn't fit for purpose, if you will, because simply we wanted to feed markets rather than feed people, and that transformation and so many other topics that you have alluded to. You have also alluded to particularly jade, of that toxic triangle, and something that was maybe provisional has become more normalized. Not provisional, but we thought was temporary. So we're thinking about hunger as something that's an everyday occurrence. So we're used to it, and these should be aberrations rather than normalizations. So we thought these things would be short, medium term, but not long term. And now we're used to dealing with hunger as a long term thing. And then the need to adapt the solutions, to have solutions that are real rather than false or potential, and the articulation of all the different movements to be able to demand accountability. We need to make these real solutions more visible, and you have tabled a number of interesting solutions, small-scale fishery, and that defends the communities, the fishery communities, the local and the indigenous people, as Jones was saying, and that there should be we should have a system of collective mutual support rather than be dependent on charity. We're talking about human rights, and human rights in big words, and we're talking about right to food and nutrition, but then we need to talk about everything that comes with that right to food and nutrition. I think we have to leave it here, I'm afraid. I don't know whether Yifan wants to add something or let us something else know. I know that now we're all thinking, our brains are firing up, and I'm sure we're full of great ideas, but you have the links on the chat. I think you can see the links on the for the watch in different languages as well. We are recording this conversation, and we'll share the recording with you. It'll be shared through the web, through a microsite, and then thank you for your participation, and well, we will continue our debates, and we will continue fighting so we can have food sovereignty. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Greetings. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye. Thank you to the translators.
Perdón, muchas gracias, intérpretes, que me olvidé.
Thank you to the interpreters, and bye-bye. Apologies, I forgot. Martin has just reminded us.
Thank you, Ifan. Thank you, Martin.
Bye.